I'm also glad to see the Secretary of State for Education, who is now in her place after being conspicuously absent, and perhaps she would take the opportunity to apologise.
The atmosphere in the House of Commons reached a boiling point after Member of Parliament Bridget Phillipson was hauled back into the chamber for her explosive remarks about the UK education system. The tension was palpable as she tried to retreat from the storm of the outrage, but the Conservatives weren't letting her off the hook that easily.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. I just want to take him back to a brief point that he mentioned regarding the Shadow Education Secretary's tweet, which I thought was disgraceful. The divisive language behind that.
The Secretary of Education posted a controversial claim about the needs of public institutions, followed by a proposal for a 20% value-added tax rate on private schools starting January 2025. It means the business rates relief enjoyed by independent institutions will be axed by the government. Sounds like Phillipson's propagating a class war here. Ending the elitist education privileges in the UK surely sounds good if you overlook certain aspects of it.
And I think it's false economy anyway, because the government hasn't done its sums quite right. They're talking about over £1 billion going to be made by the state sector from taxing or putting VAT on private school fees. But there's going to be a lot of youngsters, maybe several 100,000 youngsters going from the private sector into state schools. So there's going to be more pressure on places in state schools. So we've got to pay for those.
Exactly. The knock-on effect of this new VAT tax is clear as day. With over £1 billion in extra taxes, private schools will inevitably pass the burden on to parents and students. Fees will soar, leaving many families with no choice but to pull their children out of private education. What's going to happen then?
So this suggestion that half of kids would have to leg it for the hills into the state.
Thousands of students will flood into public schools where fees are affordable, but this will overwhelm an already strained public sector. The infrastructure just isn't built for that kind of influx, and the quality of education could suffer as classrooms become packed and resources spread thin.
The divisive language behind that tweet, the divisive language, Mr. Speaker, behind that tweet, I think was a disgrace to many of the independent schools that play and work hard and play.
Paul Holmes is right. These policies project ignorance at best.
At the moment, and private schools are businesses who can choose to make decisions about how they make their budgets stack up, something that state schools have had to do relentlessly over the last 14 years under the Conservatives, and I think private schools can learn how to cut their cloth.
Tax or ban? That's the summary of Labour policies.
But if we form the next government, we will press ahead with this because our focus is on driving high and rising standards in our state sector, but we've got to pay for it. And this policy, according to the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, would raise £1.3 to £1.5 billion net, and we would invest that money directly into our state system where the vast majority of children go to school and where your viewers will want to see better outcomes for their children.
Sounds beneficial for the public, until it comes to realize that many of them won't be able to put their children even in state schools after this overburdening. Phillipson's comments and actions show a worrying disconnect from the very real challenges her policies are creating.
Our plans to impose VAT on private school fees are about driving high standards in our state schools.
Bridget Phillipson's harsh remarks about private schools being responsible for their closures have left many questioning her grasp on the situation. It's almost as if she didn't realize the devastating impact this new tax would have, not just on the schools, but on the families who rely on them.
But we need to do more, and we do need to raise money to invest in our public services and to invest in our schools. And that's my focus as Secretary of State, making sure that we've got brilliant teachers supporting our young people, and that does involve making choices.
The logic behind this tax is deeply flawed, as it isn't about improving education, but about slapping on a tax that's bound to have dire consequences for both the private schools and the parents already stretched thin by high tuition fees.
He's an education chief. This is Rudolph, great name, Elliot Lockhart, who's the chief executive of the Independent Schools Association. He said many smaller private schools are already on a financial knife edge and will be out of business if Labour puts up the fees by 20%. That is a VAT tax raid, the Telegraph calls it, and there's the question about when this will actually happen.
If smaller schools are forced to shut down, as Education Chief Rudolph Elliott Lockhart pointed out, parents will have fewer options. And for the ones that remain, it's inevitable that they'll push this new 20% tax onto the families, inflating already sky-high fees. The idea that this won't backfire is wishful thinking.
The sound of happy children will only be heard here for a few more weeks. St Joseph's Private School in Stoke will close its doors permanently in December.
What have you got on that leaf?
As the government's new policy to add 20% VAT to private school fees kicks in, the number of students here has plummeted from 80 to 32.
They just see that they can't afford to carry on when the fees are going to be rising so much.
The impact will be felt by all, but this head teacher says in particular by those with special educational needs.
There's a number of children who've got special educational needs that are going to need support that they get here, one-to-one support.
Private schools closing in huge numbers or becoming downright unaffordable will add massive pressure to the public sector, creating a domino effect that could destabilize the entire education system. Bridget Phillipson needs to answer about these projected consequences as well.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend who as ever makes important points. I too am disappointed that the Education Secretary is not with us for this important debate today. But Mr. Speaker, I will make progress.
It was really cowardly of Bridget Phillipson to run from a debate in motion to avoid the questions and taunts. Sounds like she carried out the Labour legacy quite well. After all, her Labour peers up to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Prime Minister also have a habit of ducking tough questions rather than facing them head-on. However, Phillipson was forced back into the chamber, where the spotlight was even harsher.
I'm also glad to see the Secretary of State for Education, who is now in her place after being conspicuously absent, and perhaps she would take the opportunity to apologise for the tweet. Parents who send their children to independent schools, who pay twice for their children's education, deserve better than to be treated with contempt by their government's education.
Thought she could get away with it unquestioned, didn't she? She eventually had to come down for the votes. Nigel Huddleston did not hold back as he pounced on her offensive remarks, demanding an apology from Phillipson. An apology would be the most sensible thing to do when she has managed to piss off around 700,000 students' parents who send their children to over 2,600 private schools and pay a hefty average of £17,562 in tuition.
The divisive tweet put out by the Education Secretary this weekend was shockingly ill-judged and ill-informed, sneering and smirking about embossed paper and swimming pools. Does the Secretary of State really not understand or recognise that not every independent school is like Eton or Harrow? It betrays incredible lack of awareness and poor knowledge of the facilities and financial status of many independent schools in this.
The VAT policy might seem like it's targeting all private schools equally, but in reality, it's going to hit the smaller institutions much harder than the elite ones like Eton and Harrow. These prestigious schools have the resources and influence to navigate the system, so they'll likely reclaim substantial amount of taxes on their capital assets like land and buildings. Meanwhile, smaller private schools, which lack such financial muscle, will either pass the cost directly onto parents, many of whom are already stretching their budgets, or face the grim reality of closure.
Indeed, and you know better than I, Chris, that not everybody that sends their kid to a private school is stinking rich. I say this, I give this example all the time. I've lost count of the amount of black cabs I've jumped into, and the driver has said, yep, I send my kids to private school, I do an extra X amount of hours per week just so I can do that. I'm not rich, I am a working man who has just decided that that's how I want my kid educated. We're not North Korea, it's my choice. Somebody like that would never be defined as being part of the super rich or the elite, and yet they're the very people that will also be penalised.
It's a regressive move that punishes middle-class families, sending their children to modest private schools while protecting the wealthiest institutions. Despite the severely terrible implications for the people and small schools, Bridget Phillipson is still persistent about allowing the school VAT tax rate to proceed. This arrogant attitude towards a fraction of the population must be stopped. The Labour government needs to work on giving benefits to the collective population,